The echoing depths. It was supposed to be a straightforward urban exploration. James and his two friends, Lily and Marcus, had heard about the abandoned train tunnels on the edge of town. The place had a reputation. The echoing depths, where sound was said to travel forever, never truly fading. Locals whispered about disappearances, but the trio dismissed them as small-town legends. They came equipped with flashlights, recording equipment, and a thrill for the unknown. The entrance was a gaping maw in the earth, covered in graffiti and rusting metal signs warning of danger. James felt a momentary hesitation but shook it off. "Let's get some footage for the channel," he said, trying to mask his unease. The air inside was damp and carried a faint metallic tang. The deeper they ventured, the more the world outside seemed to fade. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally, overlapping and reverberating in ways that made it difficult to tell where the sound originated. "We should mark our way back," Lily suggested, tying a piece of red ribbon to a protruding pipe. Just in case. As they moved deeper, strange things began to happen. Their flashlights flickered despite having fresh batteries. Marcus swore he saw movement in the shadows, but when they turned to look, there was nothing. James laughed it off, though his laughter sounded hollow even to himself. It wasn't until they reached a collapsed section of the tunnel that things took a darker turn. Among the rubble were old belongings: a rusted watch, a child's shoe, and a backpack still containing schoolbooks. The trio exchanged uneasy glances. "This isn't normal," Marcus muttered. Then the sound started. At first, it was faint, like whispers carried on a breeze. But they were underground and there was no breeze. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "We're not alone," Lily whispered, clutching James' arm. Her flashlight beam darted wildly, illuminating the damp walls. For a brief second, James thought he saw a figure. A pale face with empty eyes staring back at him. "Let's go," he said, his voice tight. "Now." They turned back, but the red ribbons Lily had tied were gone. The tunnels seemed to stretch endlessly, warping and twisting in ways they hadn't noticed before. Panic set in as they began to run, their footsteps overlapping with other, heavier steps that didn't belong to them. "Keep going," Marcus shouted, but his voice was drowned out by a deafening roar, like the sound of an approaching train. The ground trembled beneath them, though no tracks remained. Lights appeared in the distance, blindingly bright and moving fast. "Get to the side," James yelled, pulling Lily with him. They pressed against the cold, wet wall as the light rushed past. But there was no train, just an unbearable wind that carried screams. When the light faded, Marcus was gone. "Marcus!" Lily screamed, her voice echoing endlessly. But there was no response. James pulled her forward, desperate to escape. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct. They spoke their names, repeated their fears, and laughed. The tunnel seemed alive, pulsating and breathing with a malevolent force. Finally, they saw it, a faint glow that signaled the exit. They sprinted toward it, their legs burning and lungs screaming for air. Just as they reached the opening, Lily was yanked backward by an unseen force. James turned, his flashlight catching her terrified face as shadowy hands dragged her into the darkness. He reached out, but it was too late. She was gone. James stumbled out of the tunnel alone, collapsing onto the dirt. The entrance was silent now, an unassuming void. Days later, search parties found no trace of Lily or Marcus. The authorities dismissed his story, calling it the ramblings of a traumatized man. But James knew the truth. He could still hear the whispers in his dreams, calling him back to the echoing depths. And sometimes, late at night, he thought he could hear their voices among them. The hollow woods, The hollow woods were an unmarked patch of wilderness just outside the county's borders, a place locals avoided for reasons they couldn't quite articulate. Quinn, a biology graduate student, had no time for folklore. Her thesis on unexplored ecosystems led her there, armed with a notebook, camera, and determination. "Keep to the edge of the forest," the old gas station clerk had warned, handing her a map marked with shaky red lines. "It's not safe to go deeper." Quinn had nodded politely but dismissed the warning. Superstitious nonsense wouldn't derail her research. The first few hours in the woods were uneventful. Quinn cataloged unusual plant species and collected soil samples, the quiet serenity of the forest lulling her into a false sense of security. But as the sun began to set, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, and the distant calls of birds and insects faded into an unnatural silence. She adjusted her headlamp, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. "Just the usual nighttime chill," she muttered. But when she checked her compass, the needle spun wildly, refusing to settle. Unnerved, Quinn decided to head back. The path she had marked with biodegradable ribbons seemed unfamiliar, twisting in ways it hadn't before. Trees loomed closer, their gnarled branches clawing at the darkening sky. As she walked, she noticed something strange. The woods around her were utterly still. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. Her breathing sounded unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. Then came the first sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like knuckles rapping against wood. She froze, her headlamp sweeping the trees. The sound seemed to echo, coming from every direction at once. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to stay calm, gripping her pocket knife tightly. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. No answer, but the tapping stopped. Relieved but wary, she quickened her pace. That's when she saw them. Carved into the trees were hundreds of symbols, crude and overlapping, as though made by unsteady hands. They hadn't been there before. The sight made her stomach churn, and she fought the urge to vomit. A low hum began to fill the air, growing louder with each step. It wasn't a natural sound. It vibrated in her chest, disorienting her. She stumbled, her headlamp flickering, and fell against one of the marked trees. Its bark felt wet and pulsing, as if it were alive. She recoiled, biting back a scream. In the dim light, she saw movement. A figure stood just beyond the reach of her headlamp, its form elongated and wrong. It didn't move like a person. Its limbs seemed to bend at unnatural angles. Quinn's breath hitched as it tilted its head, staring at her with eyes that glowed faintly like embers. Panic overtook her. She turned and ran, branches snagging her clothes and scratching her face. The hum grew louder, and she could hear something, no, many somethings, moving through the trees behind her. They whispered in a language she couldn't understand, their voices overlapping in a nauseating cacophony. Her foot caught on a root and she crashed to the ground. Scrambling to her feet, she realized the whispers had stopped. She looked up and gasped. Surrounding her were figures, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They were close enough now that she could see their faces, or what should have been faces. They were blank, featureless, and yet they seemed to watch her with an intensity that froze her in place. One stepped forward, reaching out with a long, spindly hand. Quinn screamed and slashed with her knife, but the blade passed through its arm like smoke. The figure didn't flinch. Instead, it leaned closer, its presence cold and suffocating. In a surge of desperation, Quinn hurled her backpack at it and bolted. This time, she didn't look back. Her legs burned, and her lungs felt like they would burst, but she didn't stop until she burst out of the tree line and into an empty field. Collapsing to her knees, She looked back at the forest. The figures stood at the edge, their glowing eyes watching her. Then, one by one, they faded into the shadows. Quinn never returned to the hollow woods. Her thesis remained incomplete, and she refused to speak of what had happened. But sometimes, when she passed a wooded area, she swore she could feel them watching, waiting for her to step too close again. The carnival that never left. Jackson had heard the rumors for years. The abandoned carnival just outside his hometown was said to be cursed, a remnant of a traveling show that mysteriously vanished one night in the 1950s. The townspeople claimed it reappeared every few decades, drawing in the curious and unwary. Those who dared to visit often returned with blank stares and fragmented memories, if they returned at all. As a budding journalist, Jackson couldn't resist the lure of a story that had terrified his town for generations. Armed with his camera, flashlight, and a voice recorder, he ventured into the woods on a chilly October night. The moon was a thin crescent, casting just enough light to navigate the overgrown path leading to the carnival grounds. When he arrived, the scene was surreal. The carnival looked as if it had been frozen in time. Rusting rides stood silent, their colors faded but still visible under layers of grime. The Ferris wheel loomed overhead, its carriages swaying gently despite the lack of wind. Strings of broken lights hung limply between stalls, some faintly flickering as if clinging to life. "This is incredible," Jackson whispered into his recorder. "It's like stepping into a time capsule." He approached the first booth, a ring toss game. The prizes, plush animals with matted fur and glassy eyes, sat untouched. As he reached out to examine one, a faint melody began to play. It was an old carnival tune, tinny and distorted, echoing from nowhere and everywhere. Jackson's hand froze. He swung his flashlight around, but no one was there. "Probably just an old speaker system malfunctioning," he said, more to reassure himself than anything else. He moved deeper into the grounds, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. The air grew colder, and a faint mist began to seep in, curling around the bases of the rides. As he passed the funhouse, he caught a flicker of movement in the cracked mirrors lining its entrance. He turned sharply, but the reflection showed nothing. "Just nerves," he muttered, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. At the center of the carnival stood a massive carousel, its once bright horses now chipped and weathered. To his surprise, the carousel was moving, its platform rotating slowly. A hauntingly cheerful tune played from its calliope, the notes wobbling as if the instrument itself was struggling to remember the melody. Jackson raised his camera, snapping photos. The flash illuminated the horses, their eyes appearing almost lifelike in the brief bursts of light. As he reviewed the photos on his screen, his breath caught. Behind one of the horses, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. He spun around, shining his flashlight toward the carousel. It was empty. The air grew heavier, pressing against his chest. He decided it was time to leave, but as he retraced his steps, the path seemed different. The booths and rides weren't where he remembered. The Ferris wheel was gone, replaced by a towering funhouse that hadn't been there moments before. Panic set in. He picked up his pace, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The carnival tune grew louder, more dissonant, and a voice whispered faintly behind him, "Stay and play." Jackson broke into a sprint, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reached the edge of the grounds and stumbled into the trees. When he looked back, the carnival was gone. Only an empty field remained, bathed in moonlight. Back at his apartment, Jackson reviewed the footage. The photos showed what he had seen and more. Figures stood in the shadows of every frame, their faces pale and distorted. The audio from his recorder was filled with whispers and laughter that hadn't been there before. Jackson's story became an instant sensation. But as the weeks passed, he began to notice strange things. The faint scent of popcorn in his apartment. The sound of distant calliope music when the night was quiet. And sometimes, in the corner of his eye, he thought he saw a carousel horse, watching him from the shadows. He never went back to the carnival. But he knew it wasn't done with him. Not yet. Beneath the iron veil, Maggie hadn't set foot in Dry Gulch since she was 12. The abandoned mining town had been the site of her grandfather's mysterious disappearance, a tragedy the family rarely spoke about. But when a historian reached out to her, claiming to have found her grandfather's journal buried beneath the crumbling foundation of a miner's cabin, she couldn't resist the pull of answers. The town was a shadow of its former self, little more than a ghostly collection of weather-beaten structures swallowed by desert sands. The wind howled through the hollow buildings, carrying with it the faint scent of rust and decay. Maggie parked her truck near the old general store, where the historian, Dr. Elias Rowan, waited with a satchel slung over his shoulder. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "The journal paints a fascinating picture of life here, but there's something unsettling about it. I'd like your insight before I publish anything." They settled inside the store, the air thick with dust and the creak of warped floorboards. The journal was old but well-preserved, its leather cover marked with the initials JB as Maggie flipped through the pages. Her grandfather's neat handwriting detailed the daily grind of mining life. Brutal hours, dangerous conditions, and whispers of something lurking deep within the Iron Veil mine. "The Iron Veil," she read aloud, frowning. "I don't remember hearing about that." Rowan nodded. "It's not on any official map. Most of the miners refused to work there, claiming it was cursed." Maggie's stomach tightened as she read further. Her grandfather described strange sounds emanating from the mine. A low, guttural hum that vibrated through the rock. Workers reported shadows moving in the torchlight and tools disappearing, only to reappear bent or broken. The final entries were fragmented, written in a shaky hand. "They're watching. The deeper we go, the louder it gets. Something is alive down here. We have to see it," Maggie said, surprising herself. Rowan hesitated but agreed. They followed the journal's directions, hiking through the desert to a jagged opening carved into the earth. The mine's entrance yawned like a mouth, the rusted rails of an old or cart track leading into darkness. Equipped with flashlights and ropes, they descended. The air grew colder, the light from the surface fading into a heavy, oppressive gloom. The walls of the shaft were etched with strange markings, symbols Maggie didn't recognize. "These aren't mining tools," Rowan muttered, running his fingers over the grooves. "They're deliberate, almost ritualistic." As they ventured deeper, the hum began, a low vibration that seemed to resonate within their bones. Maggie's flashlight flickered, and she cursed, smacking it against her palm. The beam steadied, but the unease remained. They reached a cavern where the tracks ended abruptly, the ground littered with rusted tools and skeletal remains. Rowan knelt, examining a pickaxe. These were left in a hurry. They didn't even try to retrieve their gear. Maggie's attention was drawn to a fissure in the cavern wall, just wide enough to squeeze through. Her grandfather's journal had mentioned a hidden chamber. Against Rowan's protests, she pushed through the narrow gap, emerging into a vast, domed chamber. Her breath caught. The walls were covered in the same symbols, glowing faintly with a bluish light. In the center of the room stood an altar, its surface blackened and cracked. Surrounding it were figures, statues, or so she thought at first. But as her flashlight passed over them, their eyes reflected the light, and their heads twitched toward her. "Maggie!" Rowan's voice echoed from behind, startling her. She turned to see him struggling through the fissure, his face pale, We need to go. Now. But the figures were moving, their limbs stiff and jerky as they stepped down from their pedestals. Their mouths opened in unison, emitting a sound that wasn't a scream but something far worse. A deep, resonant vibration that made her teeth ache and her vision blur. Rowan grabbed her arm, yanking her back through the gap. They ran, the hum growing louder, the walls seeming to close in around them. The light from their flashlights barely cut through the oppressive darkness. Behind them, the sound of shuffling footsteps grew closer. When they finally burst out into the open air, the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of red and gold. They didn't stop running until they reached the truck. Only then did Maggie dare to look back. The mine's entrance was gone, replaced by an unbroken expanse of rock. Rowan left the journal with Maggie, refusing to speak of what they had seen. She moved it to the back of her closet, but she couldn't bring herself to destroy it. At night, when the world was quiet, she sometimes heard the hum, faint and distant, as if calling her back beneath the iron veil.